The following is a Hoop Ball presentation. Welcome to the Fantasy NBA Today podcast.
What's going on, everybody? Welcome to the Fantasy NBA Today podcast, a hoop-ball presentation. I'm your host, Vince Miracle, and joining me for the final time this week, the older brother, Riaz Danani. Riaz, what's going on, my good friend?
Hey, Vince. How are you doing today?
I'm pretty good. And you notice how I put the emphasis on the word good, because we've talked now for 3 days straight, whether it be through off this show, through our little Slack channel, whether it be through Skype, and I consider you a really good friend. I don't know, like me and your brother, like he almost had to tell his fiance that we built up this really good connection. I don't know if we're at that level yet, because I mean, he and I, like, we made it like a really good connection. But today's the day where you can possibly get this rose, and you guys can be my finalists on my own bachelorette show.
Okay, I'd say I'm definitely a notch below that. So my wife has nothing to worry about with you guys.
Oh man, I'm sorry. Another thing, I don't know why I brought this up and why it just popped in my head and why I went with that as my opening, but when we ended the show on Thursday of last week with your brother, he brought up the fact that he watches a D-League version of The Bachelor with his fiance, and that's why I was like, you know what, I gotta keep going with that trend for a second week straight, especially since Dan Bespris will be here next week. I know you guys miss his beautiful radio voice. He will be back next week. You guys will be able to talk to him and hear his thoughts. But I thought I should keep the trend going, especially with the Donani still on the other side of this podcast with me. I thought, you know what, let's keep the Bachelor thing going on for Thursdays. All right, guys, so we told you that we would be talking about the Eastern Conference teams since we've covered quite a bit of the West Coast throughout this entire offseason, and rightfully so. I mean, Kevin Durant going to the Warriors and now Russell Westbrook alone in OKC definitely changed a lot of what to expect in that Western Conference. And then, you know, Jeff Teague, a former All-Star from the East, now in the West. I mean, the Utah Jazz just getting stronger. So a lot of things have changed. So rightfully so, we did talk about the Western Conference quite a bit, but I feel like we're not giving enough love to the East. So for the majority of this show, it's going to be about the Eastern Conference teams and some of these teams that we haven't really harped on enough from a fantasy perspective, and maybe a little dash of reality. We have a fan question that came in through the Twitter channel that we will be answering here on this show, and then to round it out, we will let you guys know who we believe will be the player who had to, the free agent player who had to move to a new team, who's going to provide the best fantasy output for the 2016-2017 season. Riaz, are you ready?
Oh, I'm ready. Shoot me.
So let's start off with the team that you cannot neglect to mention when you go out east, and that's the Big Apple. New York City, the city that never sleeps. I'm looking at this team, and I'm going to have to go with the West Coast guy and throw out some E40 and go, ugh, goodness, because that bench is gross. But you look at that starting lineup, and it's not terrible. Like, it's really not that terrible. I mean, Derrick Rose, yeah, he's not the Derrick Rose of old, but, I mean, he's better than Jose Calderon. Courtney Lee, I thought, was a solid pickup. Carmelo Anthony's Carmelo. Kristaps Porzingis was just, you know, Porzingod Christ last season. And then you got Joakim Noah. I mean, yes, they're basically hanging on by Stephen Curry's ankles from, like, the early 2005 season. But, you know, they do have quality players there. When you're looking at this team, Riaz, what are the fantasy assets that you see from this starting five where you're like, I have to draft this guy, or maybe I'm going to fade away from this guy?
Well, you know, when you think about it, it's interesting. With Carmelo being hurt last season, I feel like a lot of people are a lot more down on his prospects. And obviously with the way that he played with Team USA, being a leader out there, and now just surrounding himself with slightly better talent than he had in the past, especially over the last few seasons. You would just think that maybe he can have a rebound season and just, do a lot better than what people think. I think people are still a little bit sour on Melo this season, and I think that he can definitely provide some value there towards those higher middle rounds when people are not looking his way anymore.
See, I'm gonna fall on the side of the people that are gonna think his production is going to start going down. Um, but I think that those people who have the same thoughts as myself have a right to think that. I mean, yes, the injuries have been a concern, I believe, for the last 2 seasons now. But you look at the team; he actually has a quality team around him and players that can actually score the basketball. Kristaps Porzingis showed that he needs to have the basketball in his hands. Not that he needs to be the primary scorer, but he needs to get his touches. Derrick Rose, they brought him there because they want him to be the scorer, the slasher that he was. They handle the basketball like he does as a former MVP of this league. He definitely deserves that respect. Although the injuries for him have also been what's carried on this bad notion and bad cloud over him. Again, rightfully so. And then Courtney Lee, he's kind of been hit or miss, but he's a solid player. Defense can knock down the three. I mean, the ball just can't be in Carmelo's hands the entire time. You have better rebounders now. Is Kristaps a better rebounder than Carmelo? No, probably not. But Derrick Rose is a decent rebounder. Joakim Noah is a decent rebounder. And Kristaps Porzingis is a decent rebounder. So I'm looking at all that. I'm like, his numbers aren't going to go down a lot, but I do project them to go a little bit down. And I have him going in the second round. I know a lot of people are like, hey, excuse me, is he a top 12 pick? Is he still worthy of a first rounder? And I'm leaning towards no. Do you at all see an argument of why he should still be a top 12 pick?
I don't either. I mean, as much as I was saying, what I'm thinking is that people might be a little bit lower on him than usual. And so, no, I don't see him as a first rounder at all, if not even a second rounder. This is a guy that you might want to take somewhere in the third or fourth round. And so, if, a lot of times you have that guy in your league that is all about the names. And so maybe he'll reach on a guy like Melo, but I don't see his value being that as high as you're saying. I do think that he's somewhere around that 36 to 40, maybe that end of the third round type of range. And so definitely not high on Melo this season, but just hoping that other people aren't as well, and then you could find some good value there.
I think we have to talk about Derrick Rose. I mean, if you're looking at the Knicks, that's the storyline. It's not Porzingis. Everyone's hoping that Porzingis can have an even bigger year, which I think he's going to have that same exact year that he had this past season as a rookie, just because there's more talent on this team now, like I brought up in the beginning when we started talking about the Knicks. But we have to talk about Derrick Rose and if he is too much of a risk to gamble on, because he hasn't been able to play more than, I believe, 66 games. I mean, last year was the most games he's played in the last 3 years, 4 years. I mean, it's been a while since he's seen the court for a full 82 game season, let alone even 70 games. So that draws concern. He doesn't have a jump shot that you're confident with. The explosion, that first step looks a step slower. He's not finishing around the rim as strong as he used to. So he's not that same Derrick Rose. But when he's hot and when he's going, he has the potential to give you 18 points, 6 assists, 1 or 2 steals, maybe 1 3-pointer, good free throw percentage. Is he worth the gamble though with that injury history that he has? I'll even put it to you this way: would you draft him?
I would absolutely not draft Derrick Rose in any season, especially after his big injuries. That's just a guy who has a good name on paper, but his ankles are made out of paper. He's not a good investment late in your draft. He might have his moments this season, especially having a new spring in his step on a new team. But I don't think that he's going to provide the value that owners are hoping for. And of course, there's always that injury risk. I'm actually more fond of looking towards a sleeper like Brandon Jennings instead, who's playing right behind him, who might have a higher upside than Derrick Rose, just given that injury history with Rose.
I have Brandon Jennings as a complete like value play in DFS. He's going to be one of the cheapest players you can get when the season starts, and he can be one of those guys. Game one, he finally puts on that Knicks jersey. He knows he's going to be getting minutes as the backup point guard, and just goes out there and starts chucking shots. Like maybe take in 15 minutes of play, 18 minutes of play, he's taking 13 shots. Like that's what I could see Brandon Jennings doing, and that's why I think he's always going to be a nice little mid to value play in low value play in DFS. But I don't really look at him as being fantasy relevant. I think that I agree with you as well. I really do not think Derrick Rose is going to be able to withstand a full 82 game season. I just don't trust him, and there's no reason to trust him. On top of that, he doesn't really give you that great of numbers. I mean, the field goal percentage isn't great. The free throw percentage is good. Not a lot of threes. I mean, the points are there. The rebounding is maybe like 3, 4, 5 a game, which is okay from the point guard spot. The assists, 5, 6, okay. So, I mean, honestly, I would probably have a guy like Darren Collison who's taking over the starting job in Sacramento than I would a guy like Derrick Rose. And that, I think, speaks to the testament of why Derrick Rose should be overlooked, or you guys should be fading away from a guy like Derrick Rose, just because you're taking a high risk player if you draft him in those middle rounds. And I think that a lot of people will draft him that early just because, one, it's a new team and now his name is out there, and he keeps calling the Knicks a super team. Stop it. Stop it, D Rose. That is a lie. Last player here that I think we need to talk about here, Riaz, also is Joakim Noah. Does he have any fantasy relevance to you, or is he one of those players that shouldn't even be looked at on draft day?
I think in those last rounds with your last pick, when you're looking for somebody with some high upside that can give you some big man stats, then maybe he might be worth some consideration. But Joakim Noah is not somebody that I'm gunning for at the end of the draft. But I could see an argument for why at the end of a draft that he might be of some worth. But no, I'm not looking his way on draft day.
I like Joakim Noah. I mean, it just kind of depends on what you're looking for. I'm not looking at him on draft day either, though. I think he's one of those guys, if you're looking for assists from the big man spot, if you're looking for someone who's going to get you quite a bit of rebounds, that's where you go. He's more of just a specialty player. He's one of those guys, like, if you need that stat and you're playing that waiver wire, maybe you bring him in if he has like a 4-game week. That's kind of about it. I don't think you need to go and search for him in the 12th round of your drafts or anything like that, or the 10th round or anything like that. So I agree with you. I don't think that he's even draft worthy. But last question here, and then we'll move on to our next team. Is there anyone on this Knicks team, and I know you brought up Brandon Jennings, so you can bring him up again if he's the automatic answer, but is there anybody on this team that you feel needs to be on radars? Not necessarily you need to draft them, not necessarily you need to have them on your watch list, but you just need to keep an eye on them throughout this season, because if this person gets injured or if something breaks their way, they're going to have a big fantasy impact if given the minutes.
Yeah, it's just a default answer, especially with this team. They're very thin this season, but at that point guard spot, Brandon Jennings is just the guy who's gonna give you something, especially if Derrick Rose goes down. He's gonna be more than ownable. He's gonna do a good job of bouncing back and just really providing those assists and running the point guard spot for the Knicks. I just don't see much else on this roster that can provide anything else of value. It's a very top heavy roster this season.
That's why they're not a super team. Stop it, D Rose. Stop it. From the Big Apple now, let's go over to Milwaukee, where we haven't really touched on this team that much throughout this offseason. And I think that's a little bit disappointing, because I really enjoy what Milwaukee is doing with the talent that they've brought in and the young, long talent they've brought in. And before I get to all the players that I think, we're going to have a majority of this discussion on, I want to talk about the rookie and what we saw in Summer League and what you think you're going to see during the regular season. Should we just be looking at Thon Maker and saying that was Summer League, don't even look at him at all? Or is he going to be a guy that's actually going to be able to come into this NBA and step on the court and be effective like he was in summer league?
I don't see him making that leap right from the get go. He's not. He's somebody that you might want to draft for high upside late in your rounds, but it's just not. I do think that it was just a product of summer league, and we see that all the time. And it's somebody that you want to keep on your radar. You want to keep him on your watch list just in case he gets that opportunity. But the Bucks are just really crowded at those positions, and it's just not something that is a good situation right now until some pieces are moved.
Yeah, I completely agree, but I just thought I had to give Thon Maker some love because of how great of a summer league he showed out for us. So I have to say this because this is what I always say about the Milwaukee Bucks, and I'm going to start off at the center position. Hashtag it, guys. Free John Henson. This guy can block shots. He can grab rebounds. He shoots a good percentage. He needs to improve at the free throw line. But he's young. He's athletic. He fits the bill of what this team is trying to do. Hashtag it. Free John Henson. Riaz, you can agree with me. You don't have to agree with me. That's fine. I think what the bigger question is, and the reaction that I want to get from you is, do you think Greg Monroe? One, do you think Greg Monroe is going to be on this Milwaukee team next season? And two, I'm going to ask you: does John Henson need to be freed?
Well, all the signs point to him not being on the team. I mean, they just added Mirza Teletovic, and it's kind of like there's some interesting moves that the Bucks have been making. There's pretty much a logjam at their power forward and center positions, and they could definitely get rid of a guy like Greg Monroe and still just be fine. Not that he's not a great talent, but it's just not a great fit for the organization at this point. They've repeatedly come out and said that they're not trying to trade Greg Monroe, but we all know that that's false, and so. Yeah, I would say if I was a betting man, I'd say that he's still going to be on the team, but it's going to be the same story all over again about when is he going to move because it's just not the perfect fit. And along the lines of John Henson, I do believe that he needs to be freed. He just hasn't had an opportunity to be out there long term on the Milwaukee Bucks and just give all his time and effort out there. And so when he's been called upon to do so, he can go out there and get you 3 or 4 blocks in just one outing. I mean, he's not going to average that on a full season, but he's definitely a guy that's fun to watch and deserves a lot more playing time than he's getting currently.
Giannis Antetokounmpo. He's arguably everyone's favorite Greek freak player, the longest name in the NBA for sure, unless I'm wrong, but man, that name has every letter of the alphabet for sure. That's why his nickname is the alphabet. But what are your thoughts on this team constantly saying that they're going to be playing Giannis at the point guard spot? Does that intrigue you a little bit more? Do you think that's just a little bit overblown and he's really going to be being the person that he was last season, but even better? And the third question, and to wrap this whole entire thing up with Giannis, is do you see him as a first-round pick?
It's interesting that you say that. The hype train is all over Giannis this offseason. Everyone is talking about the finish that he put on the end of last season and that he's going to be a first round pick towards the end there, maybe 11th. I've seen him rated as high as 9th or 10th on some draft boards. I am definitely not on that hype train. I do think that the brakes need to be pumped a little bit on the Greek Freak. I think that he has the potential to play that way, but we haven't seen him put it together for a full season. He looked a little bit gassed towards the end of the season there, and now that they have Michael Carter-Williams and Matthew Dellavedova in charge there a little bit with the point guard spot, I think that the ball's going to be out of his hands a little bit more to start possessions. That doesn't mean that he's not going to eat and he's not going to get his minutes out there. He's going to be the first option on offense, but I just don't think he's going to have the ball in his hands the same percentage that he did last year. I think that Giannis is a fine pick in the second round. I think towards the end of the second round, I'd put him behind guys like Al Horford and players like that, maybe after the 20 range there. But I think that the hype train has just been a little bit too high for me to be comfortable investing my first round pick in that guy. That's more of a novelty item and a fun guy to have on your squad, but just not. I mean, there's so many good first round picks that you'd rather make over Giannis, and that's just not a guy that I'm high on as more than the next guy.
I'm that next guy because I'm pretty high on Giannis Antetokounmpo. I don't
Well,
know.
I hope we play in the same league. Then you can go on ahead and take him, and I'll just collect my Paul Georges out there and go for that.
Well, see, here's the thing: is I agree with you in the sense that I do not believe that he's necessarily a first round pick. Where we disagree is I'm grabbing him early in that second round. I think he's worth it. He does a little bit of everything, and he does it in a big way. He fills up the stat sheet. He gets you blocks. He gets you steals. There's already talks about him already working on his jump shot. And if he can start hitting a jumper and hitting at least one and a half, two threes a game, the versatility of this guy is going to be just crazy. I know they're talking about him being the point guard. I think that's being a little overhyped, but at the same time, he did have the ball in his hands a majority of that time. So I think that you have to look at him as at least an early second round pick. You're the very first person I've talked to actually that hasn't really been on the Antetokounmpo hype.
Well,
It's surprising.
not to spill anything, but we do have a bust list, and we do have a lot of things in that hoop ball draft guide that are coming out. And it's not that he's going to be a bust or anything like that. It's just I think that it's just a few picks too early for me to be comfortable. I haven't seen him do it a full season, and there's a lot of names out there that have done it for years and years that you just feel a little bit more comfortable about them coming in and giving you exactly what you're wanting. And so. Yeah, Giannis is just a little bit too rich for my taste this season.
I keep hearing only the first name. Let's hear you try and pronounce Antetokounmpo.
Antetokounmpo.
I,
Don't
I
put me in a spelling bee, but I can at least get Antetokounmpo in there.
I had the hardest time trying to pronounce that name for when I first found out. I was like, this guy's actually getting minutes, and he happened to be good. Oh man, I'm excited for him. We'll see which one is right, and that's a great plug. And I guess I can pause the show right here to plug it. You guys, the Hoop Ball Draft Guide is now out and ready for purchase, and we actually have a great promo going on. If you purchase the draft guide now before 10/1, you actually get the draft guide for only $9.99. After 10/1, this draft guide bumps up to $17.99. So you're getting a huge deal by purchasing this thing early. There's content going up there every single day. Riaz just brought it up about, there's going to be a bust in, what was the other one? Bust in.
There's gonna be busts. There's gonna be high risk, high reward. I mean, there's all kinds of things out there. There's team reviews, player reviews. There's a rookie report. We're going to be constantly updating these things as more injuries and all the transactions in the off season come along. And it's a 24/7 where it's 24/7 of updates and just great news and all these tools that you can use to get an edge on your guys in your league. So it's good stuff.
Definitely, guys. So go out there, purchase it now while the promo code is going on for just $9.99. So continuing on here with this Bucks team, let's move from Giannis to another young, strong prospect in Jabari Parker, who is one of my favorite young talents in this league, and I think has the potential to be a better Carmelo Anthony. Like that's my perspective on him, but he hasn't really shown it yet. So that's just me being a fan of Jabari Parker. You're looking at him, Riaz, from a fantasy side and from a reality side. What are your thoughts on a guy like Jabari Parker?
I definitely like him in the reality side. I think he's a good fit for their team, and he's overcome his injury and he's showed a lot last season. I don't think there's any complaints that you can possibly have about the way that he played last season. From a fantasy perspective, I think that his name is also putting him a little bit higher on draft boards than I'd be comfortable with. I think that he's more of a mid-round asset, maybe somewhere in the 80s or 90s. Which might be a little bit lower than you're accustomed to seeing, but that's just not a guy that I just feel like there's too many other options on that team, and that he's not going to get the same stats that you're looking for out of somebody who might be alone on a bad team. And so Jabari Parker's just he's a guy that you want to look for in the value range where it's 80 to 90 when you're making your picks.
How high has Chris Middleton moved up the board for you after what he did last season?
I'm glad that you brought him up. I think that a lot of people, all the attention is on Antetokounmpo this offseason, and I think that everyone is just hyping up Giannis, and so you're not getting as much talk about Chris Middleton. I have him going all the way up into the third round. He's not too far away from Giannis for me. Now, I know that sounds a little bit crazy, but Giannis, uh, it, he's going to have a little bit less. As I said before, he's just not going to have the ball as much as he had last season. He's definitely going to improve. He's going to be a second rounder. He could surprise everyone and be a first rounder, but he's just not somebody that I'm looking for as high as the first round. But Chris Middleton is a great pick, somewhere there in that third round. I think that he's a guy that's really coming along strong and really surprised everybody last season, and isn't too far behind. And his name is not as popular as Giannis, so you could really get some value there sometime in the middle of that third or fourth round.
We've touched on it with every team, so I'm not going to go away from it now. Is there anyone on this Bucks roster that you feel has a good chance of surprising people, and I guess is your sleeper pick of this team that could have fantasy relevance going into this new season?
I think it's interesting that we brought up Greg Monroe, and I know that he's not the most sleeper pick, but he's a guy that you're taking later in the draft, maybe in those mid rounds as well, somewhere in the 80s range, 70s. And he's a guy that if he does get the right opportunity, he's such a high risk, not he's a low risk actually, he's a low ceiling, low risk pick, but he can have a great season anywhere else if he's just moved to the right situation. So that's a guy that could finish with second round value if he goes to another organization that welcomes him with open arms and just gives him the keys to the offense, which he could do for another team. It's just not the situation that you're used to. But I would not shy away from drafting a guy like that in that mid round just because of the potential if he was moved. The floor isn't so low there with him. He's still a great player. It's just not the perfect situation. And so if you're drafting him, you're banking on him moving up a little bit higher.
Let's move on now to the city of brotherly love, Philadelphia. I am pretty intrigued with this team, actually. They've brought in a little bit of veterans. They still have those young players. They're definitely going to still be bad. But, I mean, they do have some players on here like a Ben Simmons, a Dario Saric, that could potentially give you could potentially be a pretty nice asset to fantasy owners teams. Is that out of the players on this entire roster, who's the one that sticks out to you the most that you kind of have as, I would want this Philly player on my team?
If I had to choose anyone from the Philadelphia organization, I really like Robert Covington and some of the things that he was doing down the stretch last season before he had a few minor injuries. I think that he really provides you. He can go in there and get you a 6 steal game, and of course he's not going to average something like that. But I mean, there were times last season where he was ranked in the top 20 just within those few weeks because of his efficiency, hitting 3 pointers and getting those dirty stats, the steals and the rebounds and some of those assists too from Robert Covington. So he's a guy that I'd say I'm highest on the entire Philadelphia organization.
Do you think like a guy like Covington will be affected with the new rookie of Ben Simmons kind of playing that same position? I know Covington can play the two, so maybe they can intertwine with each other, but could you see his numbers being affected now that Ben Simmons has arrived in Philly?
I could see that a little bit because all the attention will be on Ben Simmons, but that's going to leave Covington open, to hit those 3 pointers and really get involved in the offense. I don't think his value is going to change very much from what it was last season, and you might even see it increase. I'm looking at him as maybe a fifth rounder or a sixth rounder there, and so that's a little bit higher than normal for a lot of people. But I'm high on Robert Covington. I think that all eyes are on Ben Simmons, and so you might be able to see Rocco fall a little bit.
Let's talk about that big man carousel that they have. Embiid, Okafor, Noel. I have I honestly have Okafor from a fantasy side above those guys just because of what he can do offensively, but he really doesn't bring you that many defensive stats, so hopefully that can improve. But you're looking at those three. Do you think even Embiid's gonna have fantasy relevance this season? And out of those three, who would you want on your team?
Well, I would say that Joel Embiid is, he's just buried on that roster a little bit there. He could definitely provide some fantasy relevance and might be a flyer late in this draft, and maybe in the deeper leagues, somebody that you want to invest in. Certainly in the dynasty leagues, he's somebody that you want to be targeting there somewhere in the middle there. But yeah, he's just not the guy that you're looking for because he just doesn't have a pathway to playing time right now. And when it comes to which guy I would rather take. I'm definitely pretty high on Nerlens Noel this season. I think that he could provide, sixth or fifth or sixth round value, maybe a top 60 guy this season in 8-cat leagues, and maybe some top 70 value in 9-cat. I think that Nerlens Noel with his defensive prowess could end up being a guy that really wins you those weird categories that people aren't gunning for. And as far as Jahlil Okafor goes, I do think that eventually he's going to lose that position out to Nerlens Noel in that center spot, especially where he's just not going to be able to. His offensive game is on point and everything, but it's just not as efficient as you would like, and you can get those stats from other players at that point in the draft. So I have Nerlens Noel actually outside of my top 100. So I have him and I have Okafor outside the top 100. So I have Nerlens and Okafor on completely opposite ends of the spectrum this season.
Let's talk about the rookies real quick. Dario Saric and Ben Simmons. What's your thoughts on drafting rookies? I know Dan. Him and I had a discussion about this, and he likes to stay away from them. Myself, I like drafting rookies and then having their name be so big, and especially a guy like Ben Simmons, who he's going to have the ball in his hands. He's going to have those first few months of just putting up spectacular numbers. I like using them as trade bait later on in the season. I mean, that's my mindset. I know people are attracted to names in my fantasy league. I guess you kind of got to know your league. But what is your thoughts on drafting rookies? Do you do it? And would you draft guys like a Dario Saric and a Ben Simmons?
I'm not afraid of drafting rookies, but I'll admit I've never really had a chance to draft those rookies. I feel like a guy like Ben Simmons and a lot of these first round picks or first picks of the draft or second picks of the draft with those big names, they go a lot higher than they should be going when it comes to draft time. So there's never a real value there whenever you're picking them. Now, I do like your strategy that you were saying about maybe trading them later on when they do get to those, and it does take about a month or two for them to really get going. I mean, you saw that with Carl Anthony Towns last year. What a steal he was. And so, shying away is not a problem at all. And being aggressive is not a problem. But it's just that I just never see value in those picks because the name is what people are drafting over what their potential is a lot of times. And so, I have them on my radar, but they just never fall to me because there's always someone else that's going as high as fifth or sixth round for guys that are unproven. And I like to go with proven players at that point in my draft because that's your fifth or sixth best player. And you don't want to look at a guy that hasn't played a minute in the NBA just yet.
So, during our pre-production talks, before we hit the record button, I asked you to just go ahead and think of one team. And so I'm going to let the floor be yours. What's that one team that you think has the players that no one's really been talking about, and especially us on this show? I know we've been definitely West Coast driven, especially at the top tier of the Western Conference. But is there anybody else, any of these teams that you're like, let's talk about this one because I think that there's some nice fantasy assets on this team?
I think a lot of people are don't pay much attention to the Dallas Mavericks lately. They had that 2011 run and won it for Dirk and secured his spot in the Hall of Fame there. But I just think that ever since that championship hangover, it's lasted about 5 or 6 years. They've struck out on big time free agents and they've decided that tanking is not an option. And so they've really run with the status quo when it comes to maybe being the seventh or eighth seed out west, and that Rick Carlisle he does magic when it comes to putting these free agents together. It's almost like a holding spot, like a purgatory for free agents when it comes to the Mavericks. They're finally going to have some continuity this season in their starting lineup. Of course, they lost Chandler Parsons, but they're going to bring in Harrison Barnes, who I guess you could say he has some Team USA experience, whatever little that was. Um, but I mean, you do have, you're going to have Deron Williams back. You're going to have Wesley Matthews. Dirk has been there for nearly 20 seasons. There's a lot of good value there in fantasy that people are just afraid of. People are afraid to draft Dirk. Last year, he was falling pretty far down the draft board, but what people don't realize about Dirk is it's not that Father Time's going to catch up to him. The way that he plays is not physical at all. He could still make that flamingo fadeaway when he's 40 or 41, and no one's going to be able to block it. He's very efficient at shooting. He free throws and field goal percentage. He still gets his minutes out there. They might be dwindling a little bit, but he's still getting over 25 minutes per game. He's going to score the bucket and give you those efficient stats. He's not going to turn over the ball, and he's still a good rebounder. So that's a guy that still goes in the top 50 for me. And, no one should be afraid of drafting a guy like that. It's not that his numbers are going to drop off. You're not going to be the guy holding the bag when Dirk's numbers drop off, because his style of play just doesn't go with being physical. It goes with finesse. And so, his age is not a factor at this point of his career.
I don't think it's the age that they're worried about. I think it's the games played. And if this team is already, let's say they clinch a 7th seed, they know they're not going to have him in when they need him most, which is in the playoffs. And that's also going to bring me up to a guy that you didn't even mention during the analysis there, and that's Darren Williams. And he's back again for another season, another go around here. He does show potential of, being able to be that Darren Williams that, it was just 5 years ago we were talking about Darren Williams being that number 2 after Chris Paul. It's crazy how much he has fallen off. But is he one of those guys that, you have to, maybe in that late mid round, you're possibly looking at Darren Williams and just knowing I may only get 60 games and be okay with that?
Yeah, he is one of those guys that his numbers have just completely dropped off, and his fantasy prospects have as well. But he has the keys to that offense. It's a new season with some young players on the squad, and that he's in control of, and he's playing in his hometown, and through all the injury history, he's healthy this season and he's back. It's somebody in the 10th or 11th round you might be looking at. As a former, solid player there, that it's not a bad pick to take Deron Williams that late, because he does provide some good value later on. But yeah, I mean, there's always higher upside when it comes to picks like that. So I would definitely not, not hold it against anyone for passing on a little bit of an aging veteran. But he's a fine pick, but it's just, it has to be at the right price. It has to be in that 10th, 11th, 12th round, something like that.
What about Wes Matthews? I'm really high on this season. Really high on him for this upcoming season. He's now a year removed away from that injury. He's already played. He's showed spots throughout last season where he can knock down shots. I know the Mavs posted something about his numbers defensively, how strong he was, and the fact that I think he knocked down the second most or the most 3-pointers in a season as a Maverick. So I thought that was very interesting. And now hopefully he's 100% healthy. I know there's been reports of him not being fully healthy yet, but he should be there by the time the season starts. What are your thoughts on a guy like Wes Matthews?
I think that's the guy. When you told me what team is flying under the radar, that's the first guy that I was thinking of with this roster, especially in fantasy. I think that he could, in 9 category leagues, he could definitely be a top 50 player. He's coming off that injury, and now he has a full season under his belt. He's got some playing experience with this team, so he's much more comfortable in that Rick Carlisle offense. And I think that he provides very good value there in those mid rounds, and he's not somebody to shy away from. I think that as high as the 4th round, he provides a lot for your team, and so he's somebody that you don't want to give up on draft day to somebody else, because his value is there. So you might be able to find him in that 6th round or 5th round or something like that, and he's definitely a pick that should be under consideration.
It would not be fair of me if I did not bring up this player and not do the fact that he's going to be a huge fantasy player and not because he's not going to get the minutes, but everyone loves him. And maybe it's because of the last name on the back of his jersey. But what were your thoughts? Because I know you told me that you're actually a Mavericks fan as well. So what were your thoughts when you heard Seth Curry was coming over and basically taking over that Raymond Felton spot? Do you have expectations for him?
It's exciting because you see a guy like Seth Curry with his DNA coming onto a team, and you're just kind of like, well, this is an exciting player. You know, he had his moments there with the Kings towards the end of the season when he was getting more playing time. But and it's exciting to have him. But in fantasy, I don't see a spot for him on my roster or any roster. Maybe in the deeper leagues, you might be able to find some value there with Seth Curry. But I just, and I think from a basketball perspective, I think that he landed in a great spot learning from Rick Carlisle. I really do think that he's one of the top 3 or 4 coaches in the NBA, and so and that's really good for him. But it's just not a guy that I'm looking for to benefit from a fantasy perspective.
So if Darren Williams gets injured, which, you know, is possible, as we've seen, do you then look at Seth Curry or do you look at somebody else on this team, like maybe a Devin Harris, before you go to Seth Curry? But let's say Darren gets injured. Do you turn to Seth and say, okay, maybe now he can be worthy of picking up off the waivers?
I'd be looking at a guy like JJ Barea. There were times last season. It's funny because he's the tiny Puerto Rican on the team, but there were times last season, especially in the month of March, around that fantasy playoff time, where he was taking over that team and willing them to that 8th spot and 7th spot in the West there, that he in that race. JJ Barea was on fire, and he's a good value. He provides good value with assists and 3-pointers, and he can score the ball. I mean, he had some games last season where he was scoring in the 20s and possibly 30s, and so that's a guy that I would actually prefer over Seth Curry at that point. But I do think that would open a door for Seth, and hopefully he would get some minutes there in the rotation.
All right, Riaz. Well, to round out this show, we're actually going to take a fan question. If you guys ever have any questions, whether it be Dynasty, 9-cat leagues, 8-cat leagues, or even DFS questions, send them on in through all social media platforms of #FantasyNBAPod. We read them, we see them, or you can, of course, at us on Twitter, at RiazD, at VM Center, or, of course, the site at Hoopball Tweets. Our question comes from Charles Koo. His question is, what would you get for the 5th pick, Kawhi, Cat, or Davis?
That's a great question. I would be all in on Cat. I think Karl Anthony Towns, he has the potential to be a top player this season in fantasy. The expectations seemed a bit high to start last season, but then he he overrode those expectations by far. And I think that he's only getting better, and he's in a great situation, and he's the face of that franchise. I think that he's a solid pick, and somebody that he's a rock that you want to be taking at that time.
I have to agree with you. I think Karl Anthony Towns is in for a very big season, and honestly, I don't even have Anthony Davis in the conversation. More of like I'm choosing between Kawhi and Karl Anthony Towns, and that's kind of where like my split is. I like Anthony Davis. I'm not underestimating Anthony Davis at all. He's definitely worthy of a top 5 pick because of what he can do, but he just keeps getting injured, and that bothers me, and that worries me. And so I'm looking at Kawhi. I'm looking at Cat after what he did last season. I'm like, okay, I know what to get. They're very durable. I mean, it's only one season, but still, Cat showed he can be durable, and he can block shot, get steals, knock down a 3, knock down a mid-range jumper, and hits good field goal percentage.
No, I'm with you there. And one thing that I want to point out to the listeners is these are all 3 of these are great players. They're all worthy of first round picks. But if you're asking us to discern between certain players, then we are going to throw some dirt on one of the other. And so, yeah, that injury tag with Anthony Davis is the scary thing. The more the gamblers in your league are the ones that'll take a chance on him, and that's totally fine after that 5th pick. To go for Anthony Davis at some point, just because he does have the potential. Of course, he was the 1 or 2 pick last year with Steph Curry rotating between leagues. And so he's still an excellent player, and he can provide exactly what you were looking for last season. But it's just that injury tag, like you were saying. And with Kawhi, I guess the tiebreaker for me between Cat and Kawhi is that they are going to add Paul Gasol to that team. And I think that Kawhi's numbers he had a lot of career numbers last year. And so you're not expecting, you can't expect career numbers every single season. He is getting better every single season. And so that, by all means, he might be the top guy and kind of prove me wrong. But I don't expect that from him just because some of those numbers were outliers last year, especially the field goal percentage and the raise in his offensive game. Not to say he's going to tail off too much. It's just if you're asking me to pick between Karl Anthony Towns or Kawhi Leonard, I'm picking Karl Anthony Towns.
Another question that we got here, and it's from Charles again, and I'm going to kind of rephrase it a little bit because I think it is a question that we'll probably get when it comes closer to draft time. But if you're wanting to get the first pick in a draft and you have to trade for it, what's a good trade for that number one pick? And I know that's kind of hard, and that's kind of a question where you kind of have to know your fantasy league. But for me, I think automatically you have to add your first round pick to it plus something else if you want that first round pick.
I'm completely with you. I mean, you definitely, if you're looking for that first pick for whatever reason it is, if it was for fantasy basketball this season, I don't think that it's worthy of a trade because I think the fifth and first pick are very, very similar players. But and if it's in any draft, in baseball and in football and basketball, I think that when you're trading for that number one pick, that you definitely have to attach your first rounder. And then you have to add something else, but you don't want to give away your top assets. You don't want to give away a second or third or even a fourth rounder. You want to stay in that range and keep those top 4 or 5 picks that you have. And a lot of times people don't want to make that trade to just pick up something boring like a sixth rounder to just move back like 5 spots. But that's okay. You don't want to make that type of pick. You don't want to lose those assets. It's always better to be the one that's receiving more picks and not losing much ground, especially when you're talking about such a premier pick like the first round.
So remember, guys, if you guys have any of these questions that you want to get on the show, continue bringing them in by just using hashtag FantasyNBAPod on all social media platforms. And another great thing about this Hoop Ball Draft Guide that we're also doing with these premium products on hoop-ball.com is we're going to have a Q&A section. So you guys can actually go on there and purchase who would you want to be as your fantasy expert throughout this season. And there's different price ranges for how many questions each week and things like that. And there's also price ranges for how fast you want your responses. But you guys can get all of your questions done through one fantasy expert and have that back and forth with someone throughout the entire season on that Hoop Ball site. So definitely check out hoop-ball.com. And I think, Riaz, that is our show. So being that this is the last show of this week with you and I, and again, Dan Besbris will have another Hoop Ball writer on next week as he comes back to the show. Let the fans out there know, one, your Twitter handle, where they can find you online, and what to expect from you throughout the entire regular season until they hear from you again.
Well, you guys can find me on Twitter at RiazD. That's RIAZ, capital D. And so you can definitely find me on all social media platforms, mainly on at RiazD. And this season I'm going to be doing some daily dish. I did a little bit of that at the end of last season, reviewing, especially on Wednesdays. That's usually my day in the rotation. But also this Hoop Ball Draft Guide, you guys have to get out there and purchase it. There's been countless hours in research, algorithms, and all kinds of things to get those rankings out, to get those player reviews out, those team reviews, the outlooks. There's a lot of bold predictions on there and stuff that you're not going to find anywhere else. This is a premier bunch here, and it all started with Aaron Brewski, and so he's going to have his Brewski 150, if anything. Purchase it for that purpose because he constantly beats the competition every single year, and that's one secret that I had that's come out now. That's what I was using to beat my opponents in fantasy.
Definitely, guys. So go follow him again at RiazD on all social media platforms. Look out for all of his amazing work on hoop-ball.com, and we keep on saying it because it definitely is a must-need product for fantasy, which is that Hoop Ball Draft Guide as well as the Brewski 150. So definitely be on the lookout when that goes out on sale. But go get your Hoop Ball Draft Guides today. Again, for that promo right now, it's $9.99, and it'll soon be bumping up to $17.99. So go out and get it while it's cheap. You guys can follow me on all social media platforms of @VMCenter. Subscribe to this show on iTunes. It's going to be under the Cos and Brews channel for now. We will have that change soon when IDK, but we will be having it changed there soon. If you're on Android and you want to download it from iTunes, there's actually an app for that. Go download the app Double Pod, and you can subscribe to the show from there. And if that's too hard for you guys don't want to go on iTunes, you don't want to deal with all that mess, we're actually on an app called YouTube, or on a URL called YouTube. Just type in Hoopball on YouTube and look for the logo. Subscribe there. Leave us a rating. Let us know what you think about this show. Submit all your questions using #FantasyNBAPod. Dan Bespris will be back with you guys next week. Bookmark the site hoop-ball.com. And until next time, fantasy listeners, so long.
This has been a Hoop Ball presentation.